All right, welcome to Book by Book. Got a split rooms situation again. We got some folks here. We got some folks on the internet, in the cloud. Tonight we're going to finish up First Samuel, which is the tragedy of the life of Saul is going to come to conclusion. So we're going to go through chapters 27 through 31 of First Samuel tonight. So there's a lot of it's a lot of chapters, but most of the chapters are pretty short, and so we'll go through quite a bit. So let's jump in and just start in 27 verse 1. Well, let me remind everybody, David had another opportunity to take Saul's life. That's where we ended last week, but instead he just took the spear and his water jug and was like, "Hey, I got these. This is how close I got to you." And then they departed. And so 27:1 picks up Saul goes back home and David goes to on his way. And 27:1 says, "But David thought to himself, one of these days I will be destroyed by the hand of Saul. The best thing I can do is to escape the land of the Philistines. Then Saul will give up searching for me anywhere in Israel, and I will slip out of his hand." So David and the 600 men went with him. 600 men with him left and went over to Achish, son of Maok, king of Gath. David and his men settled in Gath with Achish. Each man had his family with him, and David had his two wives, Ahinoam of Jezreel and Abigail of Carmel, the widow of Nabal. When Saul was told that David had fled to Gath, he no longer searched for him. Then David said to Achish, "If I have found favor in your eyes, let a place be assigned to me in one of the country towns, that I may live there. Why should your servant live in the royal city with you?" So on that day, Achish gave him Ziklag, and it has belonged to the kings of Judah ever since. David lived in the Philistine territory a year and 4 months. Let's pause there. And so David is recognizing that running away from Saul in Israel's territories is not a good plan, because Saul has tremendous influence still, even in the Judah community, which is his own tribe. They were still like turning him. There are people who are still willing to hand him over to Saul, and so this was a concern. And so he finally says, "I'm going to go and live among the Philistines, the enemies of the people of Israel." And he had tried this before, if we remember, and they were like, "Hey, isn't that David who killed all the thousands of people?" So David started acting like he lost his mind, and they just let him go away. But now he's going back with a sense of desperation. And he goes to, the Philistines had 5 different principal cities. And so they were like capitals. And each of those cities had their own king. And the level of communication between the cities may not have been the greatest, as we'll see later. And so he goes to Achish, who is in Gath, and he is able to convince the king of Achish that I want to be a part of whatever you're doing. He offered his service as a mercenary, saying like, "You tell me where to go, I'll go fight. I've got 600 men, I've got an army, we're good to go." And so Achish welcomes him, but then David is also a pretty smart guy, because he was really close to a king in the past, and that king tried to kill him multiple times. And so he's like, "Hey, King Achish, I am not worthy to be so close to you in proximity. So I don't want to hang out in Gath with you. Like, why don't you just give me some country town out of the way?" And that's his motivation to go to Ziklag. He's going to be far enough away from Saul, who is about maybe 30 miles away, and he'll be far enough away from Gath, where he will be able to kind of do his own thing and not be in anybody's way, and have a little bit of a buffer between all of these kings who could be a threat to him. And so the king of Gath, Achish, is like, "Yeah, that sounds like a really good deal, because now I've got a mercenary. Like, I've got a guy who I can point his army at and take care of things." And so he's on board, and the yeah, so they go ahead and do this. Verse 8. Now David and his men went up and raided the Geshurites, the Girzites, and the Amalekites. From ancient times, these people had lived in the land extending to Shur and Egypt. Whenever David attacked an area, he did not leave a man or woman alive, but took sheep and cattle, donkeys and camels, and clothes. Then he returned to Achish. And so these tribes, the Geshurites, the Girzites, and the Amalekites, they are kind of like the first two, the Geshurites and the Girzites, are kind of affiliated with the people of Israel, but loosely. But they're not like the greatest of allies, and so they're kind of this in-between enemy-friend relationship. But the Amalekites are ancient enemies with the people of Israel. The Saul's downfall, if we remember, was that he was not willing to completely eliminate the Amalekites. And so instead of eliminating all of the soldiers, he kept the best soldiers, alive. And Samuel said, like, the Lord desires obedience, which is greater than sacrifice, and rebellion is like witchcraft, which will come into play later in this passage today. And so, so David is fighting the enemies of God while living among the Philistines. And so but these all other tribes could also be enemies of the Philistines. And so he's not attacking the people of Israel or Israel allies, like out and out allies. And so he's kind of in this in-between place where he's fighting battles and he's able to build supply his troops with plunder from these different battles. And so he's supporting his army and things are going well for him. And he's doing the king of Gath favors here as well and taking care of these other tribes. When Achish asked, "Where did you go raiding today?" David would say, "Against the Negev of Judah," which is, he was in the region of the Negev, but he wasn't fighting the people of Judah, or against the Negev of the Kenites. Again, the Kenites are a tribe that's kind of loosely affiliated with the people of Israel, so not Israelites directly. He did not leave a man or woman alive to be brought to Gath, for he thought they might inform on us and say, "This is what David did." And such was his practice. As long as he lived in the Philistine territory, Achish trusted David and said to himself, "He has become so obnoxious to his people, the Israelites, that he will be my servant for life." And so David is not doing anything where he's actually fighting against the people of Israel, but the king of Gath is hearing what he wants to hear. And David is saying things, well, it's true, but it's not completely accurate. Like he's kind of playing both sides here because he's a man without a country. And so he's a double agent of sorts. And so as he's fighting these different people, he is also looks like he's building a negative reputation with the people of Israel. And so the king of Gath's like, excellent, I'm using David as a pawn. And all the while, David is doing his own thing. David is not really anybody's pawn in these stories. He's, attacking and doing what he feels best for his people. So let's jump into 28. In those days, the Philistines gathered their forces to fight against Israel. Achish said to David, "You must understand that you and your men will accompany me in the army." David said, "Then you will see for yourself what your servant can do." Achish replied, "Very well, I will make you my bodyguard for life." So here, this is an interesting dynamic because Achish is finally saying, like, all right, we're going to go attack Israel. And you need to know that you're going to be front lines attacking Israel. And David's response, you will see what your servant can do. It's so vague. Like, I'm a great warrior. And it's like, you'll see what your servant can do. Could be like, oh, well, I could fight against them. Or you will see that I can defeat you. Like, David is not giving solid commitments to anybody here. You'll see what we can do. And so Achish, again, thinks like, well, then he's just going to be in my pocket, basically, as a bodyguard. And this role is a position of great honor and great trust, but it is still a subservient role to the king. And David's been in this place before. When he was in Saul's service, he was essentially his close bodyguard, and even like as the worship leader in Saul's court Like he was still a military person, so he could fight to protect Saul as well. So it's just interesting how David is able to woo people in such a way where they trust him more and more and more. And he's also trying to say like, I don't really want to fight against Israel. And we're going to see this. He's willing to do things that are hard, but God protects him from having to do that. So this is where David's story is going. And then we get in 28, starting in verse 3, we get an aside story. And there's a chronology situation here where what happens in this next section is it actually happens a few days from where it sounds like it's happening, because we're going to see like the writer will go back in time after chapter 28. And so just keep that in mind. This is a narrative shift where we're getting like some back and forth in time. So verse 3 says, "Now Samuel was dead, and all Israel had mourned for him and buried him in his own town in Ramah. Saul had expelled the mediums and the spiritists from the land." So the writer is highlighting this fact that Samuel is dead. And there's a foreshadowing here about what Saul had done. Saul had done a good thing, something that is in line with God's commands, because there should be no mediums or spiritists in the land of Israel. And the main reason for this is because the mediums and the spiritists, the witches, all of these different spiritual forces are spiritual practices where efforts to try to get God to do things for you, or to get spiritual forces to do things for you in a way that would circumvent dependence upon the Lord. And the Bible talks about witchcraft and these different practices and forbids them for the people of Israel. And, even when we get into the book of Acts, like we see the people with all their spell books realizing that Jesus is greater, and they like burn them all, which is a tremendous fortune to do that, because they recognize that Jesus is the true way. And all of these other practices are dangerous and dark. And the Bible doesn't forbid these practices because they're fake, but because they're very, very real. These forces, like when we mess with spiritual forces, we need to be very careful to recognize like, oh no, that's a demonic activity. And we should not court demons. And so even in this story that we're about to read, the Lord is still able to circumvent the efforts of the medium and to bring about what he wants, what the Lord wants here. But we should not look at this story and say, yeah, so we should go to mediums and fortune tellers. Saul did. Saul's a mess. Saul should never be our example throughout this whole book. So let's jump in here. In verse 4, the Philistines assembled and came and set up at Shunem, while Saul gathered all Israel and set up camp at Gilboa. When Saul saw the Philistine army, he was afraid. Terror filled his heart. He inquired of the Lord, but the Lord did not answer him by dreams or the Urim or prophets. Saul then said to his attendants, "Find me a woman who is a medium, so I may go and inquire of her." And so Saul is afraid. He wants to inquire of the Lord, but as we have seen, Saul killed all the priests. Samuel is dead, and all of the prophets that were with Samuel in the school of the prophets, they're not going to trust Saul. And so nobody is speaking to Saul about spiritual things, and nobody is trusting Saul. And so he's completely alone, and God has cut him off. And so he resorts to the spiritists, the mediums. He's looking for the very thing that he kicked out of the land. And what's amazing here is one of his servants said, "There's one in Endor." Like, we kicked all these spiritists out of the land, but we know where one is. We know she's in Endor. So Saul disguised himself, putting on other clothes, and at night he and 2 men went to the woman. "Consult a spirit for me," he said, "and bring up for me the one I name." But the woman said to him, "Surely you know what Saul has done. He has cut off the mediums and the spiritists from the land. Why have you set a trap for my life to bring about my death?" Saul swore to her by the Lord, "As surely as the Lord lives, you will not be punished for this." Then the woman asked, "Whom shall I bring up for you?" Bring up Samuel, he said. And so he disguises himself. And partly like the highlighting of the disguise is because clothes are a significant indicator of your role in the society. And so the priest had specific clothes, the king probably had specific clothes. And so people didn't have photos to like say like, oh, hey, I saw you on the internet. I follow your Instagram or whatever. Like it's clothes who told you who people were. And so he's wearing different clothes and he comes at night in the dark to try to convince this woman. And she is like, no, it's too dangerous, because she's not an idiot, right? She's like, it's too dangerous to do this. Saul cut us off. And when we were reading through the Old Testament, that phrase "cut off" is a curse. And so if people were to disobey the law in different aspects, the punishment was they would be cut off from the land, cut off from their family. And so cut off could be expelling from the land, but it could also be a death sentence. And so there's some intensity to that phrase, like you're losing your life, if not your life, everything else. And so so she's like, I can't do this. And then Saul makes a vow to God to participate and like condone occult activity. Like Saul is so far gone. He's making a vow in the Lord's name to protect somebody who is doing dark things. But she agrees. He asks for Samuel. Verse 12, when the woman saw Samuel, she cried out at the top of her voice and said to Saul, "Why have you deceived me? You are Saul." The king said to her, "Don't be afraid. What do you see?" The woman said, "I see a ghostly figure coming up out of the earth." "What does he look like?" he asked. "An old man wearing a robe is coming up," she said. Then Saul knew it was Samuel, and he bowed down and prostrated himself with his face to the ground. And so she recognizes that calling up Samuel is something that the king would need, Saul would need, because he's totally cut off and he's trying to get some kind of spiritual guidance from his former spiritual mentor. And so he calls out for this, and she freaks out, and Saul can't see Samuel, but she can. And she describes him by his clothes again. So clothes are important. And so whatever Saul or Samuel would wear, like he's wearing here as he's coming up out of the ground. And so he humbles himself before her and Samuel. And Samuel then speaks to Saul, and he says, "Why have you disturbed me by bringing me up?" And so he's just like, I'm at rest here. And one of the difficulties in understanding what happens to people after they die in the Old Testament is we don't really have a well-developed picture of the afterlife in the Old Testament. We just have a place of the dead. And so we call it Sheol, or it could be called Abraham's bosom, but it's a place of rest for the people of Israel. And so Samuel is in this place of rest. And so he's very annoyed in this passage. Like, why are you bothering me, Saul? And so he says, "I'm in great distress. The Philistines are fighting against me, and God has departed from me. He no longer answers me, either by prophets or by dreams. So I have called on you to tell me what to do." Samuel said, "Why do you consult me, now that the Lord has departed from you and become your enemy? The Lord has done what he predicted through me. The Lord has torn the kingdom out of your hands and given it to one of your neighbors, to David, because you did not obey the Lord or carry out his fierce wrath against the Amalekites. The Lord has done this to you today. The Lord will deliver both Israel and you into the hands of the Philistines, and tomorrow your sons will be with me. The Lord will also give the army of you and your sons will be with me. The Lord will also give the army of Israel into the hands of the Philistines." So Samuel says, like, all of these things, I told you this would all happen, and it is happening. It has come to pass. But then what more? Like, Israel's going to lose, and this battle is going to go poorly, and Saul, you're going to die, and your sons are going to die tomorrow. That's it. There's nothing else for Saul that he can do here. He's like, it's over. And immediately Saul fell full length on the ground, filled with fear because of Samuel's words. His strength was gone, for he had eaten nothing all that day and all that night. When the woman came to Saul and saw that he was greatly shaken, she said, "Look, your servant has obeyed you. I took my life into my hands and did what you told me to do. Now, please listen to your servant and let me give you some food so you may eat and have the strength to go on your way." He refused and said, "I will not eat." But his men joined the woman in urging him, and he listened to them. He got up from the ground and sat on the couch. The woman had a fattened calf at the house, which she butchered at once. She took some flour, kneaded it, baked bread without yeast. Then she set it before Saul and his men, and they ate. That same night, they got up and left. And so Saul hasn't eaten. Now, why would he not eat? And it could be that Saul is trying to fast in a way to get the Lord's attention as well. Because if we remember back before David came on the scene, they were going to go fight the Philistines, and he commanded that none of his men could eat. It wasn't something that God told him to say. It was just something that he did because it felt right and pious. And here is one of those times again where Saul isn't eating, and it could be because he's trying to get God's favor. He's tried looking to the priests, they're not going to talk to him. Talking to the prophets, they're not going to talk to him. Praying and asking the Lord to speak to him in dreams, God's not talking to him. Fasting to try to get God's attention isn't working. All of these things Saul is doing, and all of these are just reminders to us that God departed from Saul. Saul, because of his disobedience and rebellion, lost that connection with the Lord. And Samuel's reminding him, this is all what I told you was going to happen, and now it's happening here again. And he's even when he's passed out because he's overwhelmed with what Samuel told him, and everybody's like, the medium is like, you need to eat something. Like, I'm no doctor, but you need to eat some food. And he's still saying like, no, I can't eat. And his bodyguards with him are like, you have to eat. And so she prepares a meal, they eat, and they go. And so this is, an event that happens in a couple of days from where we're going to pick up in 29, because there's some adjusting in David's life timeline and getting to where he needs to go for this battle that is the end of 1 Samuel. And so we leave Saul and go back to the life of David here in chapter 29. Sorry, I got ahead of my notes. 29. So the Philistines gathered all their forces at Aphek, and Israel camped by the spring in Jezreel. So the battle lines are getting drawn up. As the Philistine rulers marched with their units of hundreds and thousands, David and his men were marching at the rear with Achish. The commanders of the Philistines asked, "What about these Hebrews?" Achish replied, "Is this not David, who was an officer of Saul, king of Israel? He has already been with me for over a year, and from the day he left Saul until now, I have found no fault in him." But the Philistine commanders were angry with Achish and said, "Send the man back, that he may return to the place you assigned him. He must not go with us into battle, or he will turn against us during the fighting. How better could he regain his master's favor than by taking the heads of our own men? Isn't this the David they sang about in their dances? Saul has slain his thousands and David his tens of thousands." So Achish called David and said to him, "As surely as the Lord lives, you have been reliable, and I would be pleased to have you serve with me in the army. From the day you came to me until today, I have found no fault in you, but the rulers don't approve of you. Now turn back and go in peace. Do nothing to displease the Philistine rulers." "But what have I done?" asked David. "What have you found against your servant from the day I came to you until now? Why can't I go and fight against the enemies of my lord the king?" Achish replied, "I know that you have been as pleasing in my eyes as an angel of God. Nevertheless, the Philistine commanders have said, he must not go up with us into battle. Now get up early, go along with your master's servants who have come with you, and leave in the morning as soon as it is light." So David and his men got up early in the morning to go back to the land of the Philistines, and the Philistines went up to Jezreel. So finally, some sense in the Philistine forces as all the armies are coming together, and they're like, hey, who's that? This is not good. He is dangerous. Everybody else knew he was dangerous, but Achish was like, no, he's good. He's fine. Even though David had never fought against any of the Israelites in all the time he's been with Achish. And David is just kind of going along with everything, and he doesn't want to ruffle any feathers. So when Achish calls him and like, hey, we're going to go muster up here, he's like, okay, we got to go. Saul is trying to kill me. And if there's a way to, protect our lives and protect our, to secure our future, we're going to go and fight where our commanders tell us to go. So David's willing to do hard things, but all of the Lord is orchestrating events in such a way where the Philistines now are working to protect God's purposes. The other four kings are like, no, get him out of here. Like they say, like, he could cut off all our heads. Like he is the biggest threat to us right now. And that's how he's going to become king. Like they can see down the road, and Achish is like, no, he's my buddy. He's my boy. He's my guy. And so finally they convince him. And what is interesting here, when Achish goes and tells David this, he says, as surely as the Lord lives. And in our English translations, the Lord here is all capitalized letters, usually, which is an indicator to us that this is a use of the divine name Yahweh. And so for a Philistine to speak this way about David's God, it is an interesting note. Is Achish, is he somehow growing in awareness of Yahweh's power over the gods of the Philistines? Or is he just trying to be polite to David, to say, as surely as your God lives, the Lord? We don't know, but it is just an interesting note here that he would say, like, as surely as the Lord lives. And even earlier, when we have interacted with the Philistines and Yahweh, they captured the Ark of the Covenant, and they took it to the temple for Dagon, and the Ark was there, and Dagon fell over, and they picked it back up. Like, well, that's weird. And then another time, the statue of Dagon fell over again, and the hands and the head were cut off. And so there's clearly some awareness that the God of the Israelites is powerful. And so Achish may recognize that God's doing something here, and I don't want to get in the way of that. So as surely as the Lord lives, you got to do this. And what we find out is this redirecting of David and his 600 fighting men is one of the ways that God is protecting David from any kind of possible tie to the death of Saul. And David had promised, like, I will not strike down Saul. He had 2 chances and he didn't do it. And now the 3rd chance, David has to go and fight against the Israelites and the armies of Saul. And God is like, I don't want you there. The Lord is redirecting David through these pagan Philistines. And so in these 2 chapters, we have this sign to us and a reminder to us of God's amazing power, even through non-believers, even through people who are not a part of the covenant community or who are walking in the paths of darkness. God is able to still bring about his purposes for his people. And so here, Saul is reminded, everything that's happened to you, I said it was going to happen because a medium was willing to try to call up Samuel from the grave. And now the Philistine kings are like, David should not be here. And they think they're punishing him, but they're actually protecting him. And it's all God orchestrating these events. And so they go back. And the transition stories here, the story transitions to one more thing that shows us David's faithfulness to the commands of the Lord. Because when the people of Israel were coming up out of Egypt and they were going to come into the land, the Amalekites fought against them. And this is why they are the ancient enemies of the people of Israel, because during the time of Moses, the Amalekites fought them. And so they were sworn at that point to eliminate the Amalekites. And Saul had a chance to do it, and he didn't. And so what's going to happen in chapter 30 is David is going to go and actually fight the Amalekites and do what Saul would not do. So chapter 30, verse 1, I'm going to read through 17. David and his men reached Ziklag on the third day. Now the Amalekites had raided the Negev and Ziklag. They had attacked Ziklag and burned it, and had taken captive the women and everyone else in it, both young and old. They killed none of them, but carried them off as they went on their way. When David and his men reached Ziklag, they found it destroyed by fire and their wives and sons and daughters taken captive. So David and his men wept aloud until they had no strength left to weep. David's two wives have been captured, Ahinoam of Jezreel and Abigail, the widow of Nabal of Carmel. David was greatly distressed because the men were talking of stoning him. Each one was bitter in spirit because of his sons and daughters, but David found strength in the Lord his God. Then David said to Abiathar the priest, the son of Ahimelech, "Bring me the ephod." Abiathar brought it to him, and David inquired of the Lord, "Shall I pursue this raiding party? Will I overtake them?" "Pursue them," he answered. "You will certainly overtake them and succeed in the rescue." David and his 600 men with him came to the Besor Valley, where some stayed behind. 200 of them were too exhausted to cross the valley. But David and the other 400 continued the pursuit. They found an Egyptian in a field and brought him to David. They gave him water to drink and food to eat, part of a cake of pressed figs and 2 cakes of raisins. He ate and was revived, for he had not eaten food or drunk any water for 3 days and 3 nights. David asked him, "Who do you belong to? Where do you come from?" He said, "I am an Egyptian, the slave of an Amalekite. My master abandoned me when I became ill 3 days ago. We raided the Negev of the Kerethites, some territory belonging to Judah, and the Negev of Caleb, and we burned Ziklag." David asked him, "Can you lead me down to this raiding party?" He answered, "Swear to me before God that you will not kill me or hand me over to my master, and I will take you down to them." He led David down there, and they were scattered over the countryside, eating, drinking, and reveling, because they had great amount of plunder they had taken from the land of the Philistines and from Judah. David fought them from dusk until evening of the next day, and none of them got away except 400 young men who rode off on camels and fled. Stop there. And so when they get back to Ziklag, totally destroyed. Everything's gone because of the Amalekites. The Amalekites saw that the people in the Philistine territories were moving away, and so these fortified cities were going to be empty, and the people of Israel, the people of Caleb's tribes, they were going up to fight with Saul because there's 2 armies that are going to go and fight against each other. And so the Amalekites saw this as an opportunity to go and raid these cities because the fighting people are gone. And so that's what happened. They get back, they see all this has happened, and David is in a really difficult place right now because his people, his 600 fighting men, are about to turn against him because they're only here because they're following David, and they were not home because they were following David. And so everything is coming back to say, David, this is your fault, that our wives are gone, our families are gone, all our stuff is gone, our city is burned. And so they're about to turn on him, and he inquires of the Lord. Compare David to Saul, who can't inquire of the Lord because he has pushed all of the people away because of his own failures. David inquires of the Lord. Abiathar is right there with them, like, "Yeah, I'll bring you the ephod." And he asks the Lord, "Should I do this?" And the Lord says, "Yes, absolutely. I will secure the victory." And so they rally and they go. Now, this is 3 days of coming back from the front lines and where they were mustering with the armies of Philistines, 3 days to come to Ziklag, and then they start to pursue the Amalekites, and 200 people are exhausted. It's a lot of work. And so they leave 200 people, but they also, in doing so, they can set up like a way station between the front lines and Ziklag. And so they probably unloaded all the unnecessary things. Like, we're going to go to war. We don't need to carry as much stuff. We just need to go and fight. And so these 200 men are doing an important thing here as well, protecting all of their baggage. And then they find this Egyptian slave, and they're able to say, like, all right, lead us to the Amalekites. And so they get there, and the battle is described in just a few verses, 16 and 17. He led David down, and there they were scattered over the countryside, eating, drinking, and reveling because of the great amount of plunder they had taken from the land of the Philistines and from Judah. David fought them from dusk until evening of the next day, and none of them got away except 400 young men who rode off on camels. And so the Amalekites, they're like sitting pretty. Like, we won, we have all this stuff. And so they are getting drunk, they're getting wasted, they're partying, which is not a great way to be battle ready, because they think there's no, like, all of the fighting people are off fighting each other. What do we have to worry about? And so they didn't think like 400 guys are going to come down and try to get their stuff back, their people back. And so David is able to fight them. And so it says from dusk until the evening of the next day. And, fighting in the dark is probably not the best strategy. And so it's probably just like more likely that it's a dawn raid against the Amalekites. So they fight in where the sun's coming up, people are totally wasted, and they just go through and they just start wiping out drunk Amalekites. And except for these 400 who get away on camel. The Amalekites are major pains in the neck for the Israelites, and they seem to always disappear and go away, and a remnant flees. But the Amalekites are one of those people that we really only read about in the Bible. And there's no like great history or legacy of the Amalekite people, because they were continually just beaten down by different people. And here David does all he can to fight against the Amalekites and to eliminate them in accordance with what God told the people of Israel to do, because of their ancient rivalry. So David is able to defeat them. And then we pick up in verse 18, David recovered everything the Amalekites had taken, including his 2 wives. Nothing was missing, young or old, boy or girl, plunder or anything else that they had taken. David brought everything back. He took all the flocks and herds, and his men drove them ahead of the other livestock, saying, "This is David's plunder." And so the Amalekites raided Philistine cities, not just Ziklag. And David and his men went and got it all. And so they're capturing the stuff back from the city of Ziklag that was taken, but they're also able to get all the stuff from the Philistines that was taken by the Amalekites in this raid. And so the plunder of David's army is substantial. And so by right, David is, what they're saying here, that all of this is David's plunder, by right it is, because he's the commander. He can do with it what he wants, because he's not the king of Israel, but he's the king of these 600 fighters. And so they're feeling really good. 21, then David came to the 200 men who had been too exhausted to follow him and who were left behind in the Besor Valley. They came out to meet David and the men with him. As David and his men approached, he asked them how they were. But all the evil men and troublemakers among David's followers said, "Because they did not go with us, we will not share with them the plunder we recovered. However, each man may take his wife and children and go." And David replied, "No, my brothers, you must not do that with what the Lord has given us. He has protected us and delivered into our hands the raiding party that came against us. Who will listen to what you say? The share of the man who stayed with the supplies is to be the same as that of him who went down to the battle. All will share alike." David made this a statute and ordinance for Israel from that day to this. And so David is defending the right of the people who protected the baggage, who are doing this. Like, no, we are the army, not just the 400 who went and fought. We are all the army. And so the share is going to be equally divided. But so David's building loyalty with his army, which is important. But he goes one further. When David reached Ziklag, he sent some of the plunder to the elders of Judah, who were his friends, saying, "Here is a gift for you from the plunder of the Lord's enemies. David sent it to those who were in Bethel, Ramoth Negev, Jatir, to those in Aror, Sifmoth, Eshtemoa, and Rakal, to those in the towns of the Jerahmeelites and the Kenites, to those in Hormah, Bor Ashan, Athak, and Hebron, and to those in all the other places where he and his men had roamed. And so he's building loyalty with all of his men in his army, but then also reaching out to the elders of his tribe to say, I did this and I'm sharing it with you. And so this is a great political move because he's been an outcast from the people of Israel and even among people of Judah. Like there were people who were willing to turn him over to Saul. And so now he's saying, like, look, Saul didn't do this for you. I did this for you. And he's gifting them these things, and ultimately the hope is like they will see that David is a benefit to them. And so there's no strings attached to this situation, but he is winning favor with them. And so, so this is a good outcome for David. And so he's far away from all that's going on at the battle lines with the Philistines and the armies of Israel. And so this is where we learn about what's going on with the armies of Israel in chapter 31. Sorry, I just am trying to see where I'm going to stop. All right, cool. Now the Philistines fought against Israel. The Israelites fled before them, and many fell dead on Mount Gilboa. Just as Samuel said, the armies of Israel will be defeated by the Philistines. The Philistines were in hot pursuit of Saul and his sons, and they killed his sons, Jonathan, Abinadab, and Malchishua. The fighting grew fierce around Saul, and when the archers overtook him, they wounded him critically. Saul said to his armor-bearer, "Draw your sword and run me through, or these uncircumcised fellows will come and run me through and abuse me." But his armor-bearer was terrified and would not do it. So Saul took his own sword and fell on it. When the armor-bearer saw that Saul was dead, he too fell on his sword and died with him. So Saul and his 3 sons and his armor-bearer and all his men died together that same day. When the Israelites along the valley and those across the Jordan saw that the Israelite army had fled and that Saul and his sons had died, they abandoned their towns and fled, and the Philistines came and occupied them. So everything that Samuel said would happen, happened. And so the events of Saul and the witch of Endor, the medium of Endor, that happened the night before this. And so all of the things that happened with David and the Philistine commanders and fighting the Amalekites and all of that, that was all happening around the same time. The battle in Ziklag is happening the same time as Saul's defeat. And so the writer of 1 Samuel is trying to help us see, David's really far away from all of this that's happening, but it is all going according to what Samuel said. Now, here's my question. How does anybody know what Samuel said? I don't know. And so did Saul tell somebody? Did one of his soldiers tell somebody? One of the 2 that were with Samuel or with Saul, did they tell somebody? And then one of the folks that somehow survived this whole catastrophe then came and told David, or the scribe who captured all this story. We don't really know. But everything that Samuel said would happen, happened. And Saul recognizes, the Philistines have been my enemy for so long. If they capture me, then they're going to abuse me greatly. And he's like, I'd rather be dead because I'm going to die. So let's just expedite the process. But his armor bearer, like David, is saying, I'm not going to touch the Lord's anointed. He's not going to kill the king. Because what if somehow the armor bearer survives all of this, and then they say, who killed Saul? Well, the armor bearer is I did. Like, no, that's not a good place to be. I killed the king. No, that's not a good place to be at all. And so he sees Saul takes his own sword, falls on it, kills himself. And we'll see in Second Samuel, he doesn't die right away. Another person comes and finishes the job. But here, Saul dies, armor bearer takes his own life. And then when the Israelite army sees that they're defeated and Saul and his sons are dead, they all run away. They're all gone. And so the Philistines defeated the armies of Israel. So let's pick up in verse 8. The next day, when the Philistines came to strip the dead, they found Saul and his 3 sons fallen on Mount Gilboa. And they probably would have known because of the clothes they were wearing, would have been indications like, oh, these are important people. They cut off his head and stripped off his armor. And they sent messengers throughout the land of the Philistines to proclaim the news in the temple of their idols and among the people. They put his armor in the temple of the Ashtoreths and fastened his body to the wall of Bethshan. When the people of Jabesh Gilead heard what the Philistines had done to Saul, all their valiant men marched through the night to Bethshan. They took down the bodies of Saul and his sons from the wall of Bethshan and went to Jabesh, where they buried them. They took their bones and buried them. Where they burned them. They burned the bodies, didn't bury them. They took the bones and buried them under a tamarisk tree at Jabesh, and they fasted 7 days. So Saul's right when he said, like, they're going to abuse me. And they do. They cut off his head. They strip his body. They hang it up on the wall, which is a way that you would communicate to your enemies, like, this is the power we have over you. And even taking his armor, the armor of a king is a sign of their strength and their power. And so they take his armor and they put it before the Ashtoreths, which are their gods. And this is one of the ways that even going back to the ark to say, like, look, we defeated these people. Their power is nothing compared to our gods. And so they bring his armor and leave it there among the temple. It's a terrible story. Like, it's heartbreaking to think, like, this is the guy that Israel was like, yes, we wanted a king like the nations. And he does some good things, but he ends in despair. He ends as a great tragedy in the Bible. And it all comes back to his unwillingness to do what the Lord had told him to do. Saul thought he could do it better. He had a better plan, but also Saul was afraid of the people. He was afraid of them rejecting him, turning against him. And so when we look at David here in this, what we've read tonight, like, he sensed that the people are going to turn against him. They're getting ready to stone him. And what does he do? He turns to the Lord to be strengthened in the Lord. What does Saul do when he thought the people were going to turn against him? He turns to himself and says, what can I do to fix this? So there's a different response to crisis that we see in David and Saul in these chapters of their lives. But the men of Jabesh Gilead, they heard what had happened to Saul, and they rally together and they go and they take down the bodies of Saul and his sons, and they give them as proper a burial as they can. The bodies are probably infected and diseased, and so that's why they burned them instead of burying them in the normal tradition. They were probably too unclean to do all that they would normally do. So they burned them, but they did this because Jabesh Gilead, they were years and years ago, before this, Nahash came and attacked the men of Jabesh Gilead, and shaved off their beards and all kinds of stuff, totally embarrassed them. And Saul came to their rescue. Saul rallied the people of Israel to come and rescue Jabesh Gilead from Nahash. And so they remembered Saul wasn't always terrible. Saul wasn't always bad. And so we should honor him for how he led the people to rescue us in our time of need. People are complicated, right? Like, in the world, like, it's very easy to try to, like, say, like, these are the good guys, these are the villains. And even in our own country, like we have political parties that like everybody has just become a villain to each other. And like we've demonized people in our own country, in our own, like even in churches, people are demonizing one another for disagreements around the things that are happening in our country. And it's just like, we need to remember that people are complicated. There's more going on than just, well, they voted this way, or they disagree with me on this policy, or they were for this battle, or you know, we need to recognize that there are things that we should still try to honor people. And even if it's hard, to find a way to honor people we disagree with, and to show like respect and kindness whenever we can. And the men of Jabesh Gilead are a good reminder to us that, you know, sometimes it's going to cost you something, because they risked their lives to go and honor this king who was leading Israel to defeat and despair, and who had lost his mind, it seems, throughout the book. They said there was that time that he came through for us, so we're going to honor him. And that's where 1 Samuel ends. 2 Samuel picks up with David hearing about Saul's death, and and then you think, well, oh, great, Saul's dead, David will be king right away. Nope, because people are complicated, and nations are hard to persuade. And so that's where we'll wrap for tonight. Any questions on these chapters that we covered? A lot of stuff, a lot of action happening. All right, in the room, there's no questions. Anybody online have any questions? No? All right. Well, y'all, let's we'll go ahead and wrap. How are you guys feeling about summer schedule? We got a couple more weeks before school starts, and we have a natural break here. We could take a couple weeks off for Bible study, and then like pick back up with 2 Samuel after Labor Day. Would that work for everybody? So I'll take a couple weeks off from book by book, and then I will back in first week of September. Sound good?
That's fine.
Okay.
All right, cool, y'all. Well, let's pray as we are closing up this book, and let's remember God's faithfulness even in the craziness of the world. Lord, we thank you for your provision. We thank you that when there's conflict and strife in the world, as we read about in the Bible, Lord, you are still able to orchestrate things to bring about your purposes. Mm-hmm. So, Lord, I pray that you would help us to seek your purposes in the brokenness of our own time, and help us to find our strength in you, not in our political alliances and the parties of our country, or the different things that people start to rally into. Lord, help us just to gather to be your people, seeking your purposes for your glory, and help us trust you in all those things. So we thank you for your word, the encouraging passages as well as the very difficult passages. So help us find strength in you. Amen.
Amen.
Amen. All right, everybody. Well, I'll see you Sunday. Have a good couple of Wednesday nights off. So talk to you later. Bye.